Welcome to the Asset Reliability at Work podcast.
Endless journey of delight and profitability.
I think some people use it as a derogatory term towards accountants.
Being visible to the employees is important.
Hey, what's going on, podcast listeners? Welcome back for another episode on the Asset Reliability at Work podcast. In today's episode, this is really kind of special because we actually have this guest sitting right in front of us, which we always love, but it's a very special guest as we welcome in Greg Flickinger, who is the chairman of the OpX Leadership Network and Group Vice President of Manufacturing Operations at H-E-B Grocery Stores. So, as I said, we're very excited because Greg has such a ton of knowledge when it comes to reliability and innovations within the manufacturing facility. So first and foremost, Greg, thank you so much for being here and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Now, listeners, what's got us really excited here on the podcast is that Greg's not only doing one episode, he's going to do three. So it's a three-part series, and the first one, today's, is going to focus on that OpX Leadership Network. And we're going to dive into some of those issues that the members are seeing in today's manufacturing facilities. So we're going to walk through that and talk about that a little bit. And then next, 2 weeks episode is going to be the IIoT discussion, which is the Industrial Internet of Things, a very hot topic that's going on today with manufacturing leaders. And so we're going to talk about some technology and innovations that are occurring. And then finally, we're going to wrap up with how to boost employee engagement through training. So Greg's going to talk about things that he's seen and his recommendations. So let's roll right through.
Actually, Derek, I do want to mention that Greg is here, and he's joining us this week for the Executive Risk Management Summit that we're having here in Charleston. And the goals of the Executive Summit and the goals of the OpX Leadership Network that Greg is the chairman of, have some connection. So as chairman of the OpX Leadership Network, Greg, can you tell us a little bit about that initiative and what you aim to achieve?
Sure. The OpX Leadership Network is founded by PMMI, and people may be familiar with PMMI because they lead PAC Expo, which happens every year in Las Vegas, and then on the subsequent years in Chicago. They also have PAC Expos more globally as well. So PMMI saw the opportunity to bring industry together to solve industry problems. And so what we do as the OpX Leadership Network is we identify the work streams that manufacturers and namely CPG companies have as far as problems. And then we go forward to use our resources across our organizations to effectively solve industry problems by industry, for industry. So we have a number of work streams, and those work streams that are currently available, free of charge, you can go to the OpX Leadership Network website and download these, would be things such as total cost of ownership, or TCO. Capital projects, we focus on so far FAT and the RFP process. We've got a sanitary design work group. We've done product safety, really focused on low moisture foods. If you recall back when PCA had the peanut issue, and then we found out that a number of foods that we normally would deem safe had issues. We went in and said, where are the opportunities in low moisture foods and what science can we put behind it? So we commissioned a work stream against that, which also went in and influenced FSMA to a degree back when that regulation was being put in place. We focused on OEE, so everybody uses OEE, but people tend to measure it differently.
Right.
So we're trying to standardize OEE across industry, so everyone's looking at the exact same equation. So again, we can compare and measure ourselves better. We also have the sustainability playbook, workforce engagement, and some of the others that are currently under development are CIP, or clean in place, as well as worker safety. So again, things that are important to industry that we all face and struggle with, we're working together to solve those issues. And again, life cycle engineering focused on reliability, focused in many of these same areas. So there's really a nice meshing between the two.
Right, by industry, for industry.
Absolutely.
That was very well said, Greg. And now I want to shift and ask you something a little bit more detailed now. Let's talk about some of those issues that you're hearing from your members today. So as the chairman of the OpX Leadership Network, what are maybe the 3 or 4 issues that you consistently hear your members are facing in today's manufacturing? Have you faced those similar issues in your role at H-E-B?
Sure. Yeah, as a group, as time proceeds, we always find that we do have a lot of common issues. And as I mentioned, the work streams, those are items that we identified that we felt we could come together in a non-competitive nature and solve these problems. Because when you start thinking about the safety of people, the safety of products, those are things we have to work on together. It's truly non-competitive. So those are things that we have addressed, and they continue to be opportunities as we progress along those particular work streams. As new work streams evolve, we talk about those and commission work to be done in the ones that make sense. That's why you see CIP come up, and then really trying to dig deeper into worker safety, because there is a lot of information out there about worker safety. However, we still have injuries. So until we can get to zero injuries, we don't feel we've necessarily solved the issue. So we're working together, again, as an industry group to solve some of those problems. If I get into some of the things that we're facing really across industry and across consumer products goods, one today we face is economics. We see investment firms coming into play. You see 3G and others, the Kraft Heinz deal being one. And the way I look at that is they're really stripping iconic companies. They're taking away the R&D areas. They're really managing for margin. And so as a result, they're going to lose innovation. And of course, there may be some product risk in there depending on how lean the organization gets, because we really need to focus on safety of logistics, safety on our people, safety of the product. So that's one area that we all face, because the outcome of that, especially in public companies, everybody is working as hard as they can to increase margin because the whole competitive set has completely changed. So companies are under more stress just economically. So that's one that comes to mind for all of us, really. Next one is workforce. We've heard a lot about workforce. Difficulty in finding talent, particularly in the maintenance areas, electrical, programming, controls. Of course, LCE has some great classes to help in maintenance and reliability, so many companies rely on LCE to help them in those areas, but we're seeing that there's a lack of workforce. There's just not enough talent out there for us to recruit and bring into our organizations. That's one that across the whole OpX Leadership Network we all face. And over time, I think it will correct itself because the trade schools are emerging, community colleges. You're even seeing high schools bring shop and courses back to the course.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it's coming back, but if you think about the cycle, it's going to take a number of years to correct because that workforce won't be ready until later. So how do we solve this gap is one that we face. It even goes into operations. A number of companies in our group are having difficulty finding people to run their equipment, just operate, beyond maintenance, just operate the equipment. One of our members, in fact, they have a plant in Wisconsin, and they're normally running 40 to 50 headcount lower than where they need to run. So they can't hire enough people even in Wisconsin. So they at times have to make decisions of where else in the country can they move the product where they have capacity, because they flat out just can't hire enough into that workforce. So those are some big problems we see, and a couple others that then turn into more the economic side or the supply chain side would be consumer trends. Companies have built their assets basis current consumer trends or past consumer trends, and that has meant centralization, large lines that run a lot of product. As the consumers' likings have changed, now we're looking at unique ingredients, more focus on allergens, because as these unique ingredients bring tremendous number of allergens. You have gluten-free, you've got organic, and all of those create a need to really clean and sanitize differently. The other result is no longer do you have long extended runs with making a ton of product at once. You have very short runs, lots of changeovers, lots of loss within your system just by not running and utilizing your assets. So the entire way that we look at manufacturing is completely changing. So all of the companies in our group are facing these very problems, or look at it the other side, these opportunities.
Opportunities, right.
And then finally, supply chain logistics. And when you look at e-commerce, the Amazon effect, Amazon buying Whole Foods, you see this complete dynamic changing of ordering online. And so even the CPG companies, as you've probably seen in the news, are being called in by Amazon to figure out, instead of you shipping it the direction you normally do in large pallet quantities, they're trying to figure out how can I push it back on the CPG company, and maybe people can order eaches that get delivered to their door. And as you can imagine, that completely disrupts the entire logistics supply chain network we have today. So those are the four things that really come to mind for me. Those are the big issues that we hear about and we talk about in our group.
Which issues, gosh, do you think are the most challenging, and why do you think that is? I mean, you named pretty big four. Can you attack all four at once, or do you have to think about what your particular situation is? Or just talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, that becomes the big problem. If one of these items...
How do you eat the elephant?
Clearly. If one of these items hit you as a company, and we're used to this, we can go put our resources against it and really focus and then come up with a solution. The problem is they're all happening in parallel. So you can't decouple it because they're all happening to you at the same time. If you try to decouple it, then you're going to get left behind in the 3 or 4 or 5 other elements that are emerging. So companies have to learn how to be more nimble and more adaptable. And really, you have to attack them all at the same time. And the company that is able to do that will succeed. Those that aren't, they're going to fall by the wayside, and new companies will emerge. And that brings another thought into play. We see life cycles of companies. You have a new company, a growth company, and then stagnation and then decline. It just feels as if in everything we deal with, those cycles are just increasing, and the speed of change is incredible. So we're forced to take all these on at once, because otherwise you probably won't be here over the long term.
And that's why we need leadership networks like the OpX, and we also need the Executive Risk Summits and places where people can work together and try to solve these problems together, or at least work on them.
Yeah, and Tara, that's a great point. We've established, we're working on a new plant construction, and we've established a partnership with General Electric, GE, of course, big, huge global company. And almost to the person, when you talk to GE, they will say, we are not big enough and we are not fast enough to adapt. So as a result, we have to work with partners. And if someone like GE is coming and saying that just reinforces what we just said. It's about partnerships, about the OpX Leadership Network, bringing companies together to solve problems, about what LCE is doing to bring companies together to solve problems, because they're much more complex than they ever were. So none of us can solve them alone any longer. We have to work in partnership.
Now, Greg, as we get ready to wrap up this episode, which I hate to say that because this has been such a great discussion so far, but we've got a ton more questions to ask you as it relates to IIoT and then boosting employee engagement in that third episode. So let me ask you this. As someone who has extensive experience in the CPG industry, what elements or what factors are disrupting how you manufacture products today?
Great question. With the backdrop of what we already talked about, let's focus deep into manufacturing. I'll bring back the short runs. So many short runs, lots of changeovers. That's been emerging over time, and we've talked about that to a great deal, but it's just becoming more and more pronounced as consumer trends change, as ingredient profiles change, and as the life cycle of products accelerate. We need to have production lines today that can run for an hour, change over and run a completely different product for another hour with maybe a different ingredient set, different packaging conformations, different sizes, different ways to get to customers where they want to be. So that's a big one. And when you bring that back to the challenge, all of these companies have existing asset bases. Lots and lots of capital is invested. And sometimes that equipment's not capable of doing this, at least efficiently. So the question becomes, how do we take an existing asset base and transform it to the new world economics? If you're lucky and you're able to build a new line, then, of course, we need to engineer our line not only for that product but for the future. But the real challenge comes in the existing asset base. And again, I'll just come back that whatever the problem emerges within manufacturing, it becomes life cycle. It becomes how fast can you move. Our normal approach of even building a new line would typically be about a year. When you think about long lead of equipment, delivery, installation, and then startup, FAT, CQV, and all these processes to bring something to light. By the way life cycles are moving today, that product may have come and gone by the time your new line is on the ground. So we have to think forward, back to what you said, Tara. We have to think forward to what is coming, what's potentially emerging that we can factor into our designs to allow us to be flexible in the future, because products are going to come and go very quickly.
Yeah, it's like product personalization. We need our assets to be like Optimus Prime and be more like Transformers, where we can just move them faster.
Exactly. And when you think about back to the logistics piece, that may push us, instead of big centralized plants that make a lot of product cheaply, we may need to think about
boutique
regionalized plants that can make a lot of different things and serve a community or a small area. So absolutely, I would consider it mass customization.
Yeah, it's curating for your local needs, I guess.
We have to make the product for the person.
Product for the person, individualization. We say the same thing in the learning community. I know you listeners, you've got a learning professional here talking to these asset reliability, manufacturing, CPG guys and gals. And it's really fun. We connect. I mean, change is change. It's happening all over. It's happening in every aspect of our lives. So this was a fun first episode.
Yeah, and really quick, before we actually do end it, I want to, Greg, how can people find out more about the OpX Leadership Network?
Yeah, encourage everyone to reach out. If you go online, you can go to opxleadershipnetwork.org, and you can find all the work streams that I mentioned. You can find more information. You could also go to PMMI and go through that organization to get to us because, again, we're sponsored and founded by PMMI, but very easy to get to on the internet.
All right. Well, thanks for sharing that, Greg. And those links will be available in our show notes, as well as a link to Greg's LinkedIn profile to connect with him. So that'll wrap up today's episode. And remember, this is just the first episode in a 3-part series featuring Greg. The next episode in 2 weeks will feature our discussion on the IIoT, which is the Industrial Internet of Things, obviously, and new technologies that are occurring in today's workplace. So once again, Greg, thank you for joining us today in this podcast, and thank you, listeners, for tuning in for another episode on the Asset Reliability at Work podcast. Hey, listeners, one more thing before you go. If you have any feedback for the show, or you have maybe some suggestions for upcoming topics you'd love to hear about, we'd like to hear from you. So there's 2 ways to get in contact with us. The first is on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @LCE_today, so be sure to follow us. And then the other way is to email the show at podcast@lce.com. Once again, thank you for joining the show, and we look forward to more episodes on the Asset Reliability at Work podcast.